Well, let me start taking this opportunity to thank Alexandra and also Nikos, not only for organizing this wonderful event, but actually for bringing us all together. For a person that doesn't work really in this particular region, has been a really privilege to listen to the presentations. And there are a couple of things that some of the speakers highlight. And before I go to that, thank you for coming to the first presentation after lunch. I think this is always a difficult one because we are all sleepy and we are all full, which is a good and bad thing at the same time. So I will try to make it quick and sweet, but hopefully I can gather your attention for the next 20 minutes. There's a couple of things that really call my attention. Oh, I feel very small here. That's why I want to talk here. We'll try to put it like that. That's better? Yeah. There's a couple of things that I think have called my attention from the presentations we had during the morning. And there are a couple of things that are similar across all the different countries that we have explored. One of them is that we know by now that international migration is not going to stop. And it hasn't stopped for a long time. We are a civilization, we have built through migration, we have always migrated and we will continue doing it. One of the characteristics of this migration nowadays is that there is a politicization of migration that make it an issue at the public concern, a political token, and something that we think that we have to either solve or manage. And that's something that we can see across all the countries. So the effects of migration, not only the causes, but also the consequences of migration, are going to be being felt at the different levels, at the global level, at the regional level, at the state level, but also at the local level, at how the neighborhoods are dealing with them, but also how it affects individuals as well. That is something that we haven't discussed that much in this conference at the moment. So that's one thing. The other one is that, to my surprise, I have learned about many countries that I didn't know, because usually are not part of the migration debate. So what does it tell us? That there's a geographical narrowness on the discussions on migration. And that not only means that there is an overemphasis on the dynamics in Europe or the United States or Australia as traditional receiving regions and countries, and that overshadows what happened in other places around the world. So in order to try to overcome this geographical narrowness on debates on migration, I want to invite you to discuss more openly different dynamics of regional migration governance. Of course, there is risk that when we have a geographical narrowness. One, because by omitting other regions, we kind of fuel this myth of invasion to particular places in the world. When actually what we know is that there's migration dynamics happening elsewhere as well. In my own region, I'm Chilean and come from South America, we have our particular migration crisis at the moment with the displacement of Venezuelan migrants across the region and refugees. That also has put a lot of pressures to what we thought it was quite solid system of refugee protection and migration dynamics. We have elsewhere, we have a Rohingya refugee crisis in Bangladesh, we have mobility in Asia, and, in other countries of the region as well. We have, of course, a lot of internal dynamics within the African continent as well. So what we try to address in this book that is called The Dynamics of Regional Migration Governance is actually try to explore a little bit more how migration governance is understood at the regional level. This book emerged from another project that it was an ERC project led by Professor Andrew Geddes at the European University Institute. And in that project in particular, a group of researchers, including myself, tried to understand how migration governance makes sense at the regional level by doing interviews in 29 countries. We did more than 400 interviews at what we call migration governance actors. What do we mean by that? We interview politicians, civil servants, NGOs. In some countries, if they were relevant in the political debate, we interview as well unions, economic groups, etc. Everybody that had a say within migration governance in those particular countries. And what we were trying to understand, and this is one of the aims of the project, and it kind of shaped a little bit the book as well, is that we didn't want to look only at migration outcomes, which is our tendency when we study migration. We look at the policy, we look at result, we look at the response, but we sometimes don't look at the process. How, key actors within migration governance system make sense of migration. What are the factors that influence the individual that is making decisions? What are the organizational as well factors that impact those decisions? So we're trying to open in a way what we call the black box of migration governance. And as a result of that project, this is one of the particular outputs, this book. But it's not only us. Within the project, we were covering Europe, Asia Pacific, North America, and South America. Of course, that excluding many other regions in the world. So in this book, we invited also the researchers to help us to reflect about migration, the dynamics of regional migration governance in other parts of the world. So we have chapters covering Africa, we have Asia, we have North America, South America, we have Eurasia, etc. It's basically a global scope. So that's what I'm going to invite you to do in the next couple of minutes. So this book in particular, as I said before, focuses in the dynamics of regional migration governance, by which we mean cooperation between states, usually defined by their geographical proximity on aspects of migration and mobility. We understand migration and mobility. Mobility we understand more in the context of a regional integration process in which people can move with certain facility. And migration, we include a variety of migration dynamics. We didn't only look at economic migration, but some of the chapters focus on refugee and asylum, other focus in other migrant categories as well. Now, the characteristic of the book and what the book is trying to do is trying to give us some lights and some ideas on why, how, and with what effects a state cooperates with each other in such a regional groupings of various types and aspects of international migration, but also trying to show how and why international migration can also lead to tensions between states that can prevent or hinder cooperation, which is something that became very clear as well in some of the presentations we heard today. In some cases, we assume that because some states are proximate together, they share some cultural background, or they share some values and ideas, we assume that cooperation will be easy. But what, of course, the reality shows us is when there is sometimes what we call a crisis or a pressure to the system, that cooperation actually might not exist, and actually it can prevent as well that happen. Now, as I said before, we cover different forms and patterns of regional cooperation in Africa, Southeast Asia, Central Asia, Eurasia, Europe, the Middle East, North America, and South America. And the analysis in the chapter tried to give us an account of the many varying forms of regional organizations can take. And of course, because many of these ones are already different. As you can imagine, the European Union is, of course, one of the most accomplished regional integration projects within this entire map that we have in the book. We have other completely different ones, like ASEAN. ASEAN, they have a particular structure in which they act by consensus. So all the 10 states part of this particular project, they have to agree, which means that progress is very slow because it's difficult to get consensus of 10 states at the same time. In South America, for example, we have different integration projects that, of course, have changed as well according to the political landscape. At some point, 10 years ago, we had not only Mercosur putting a social agenda forward that included migration, but then we also had UNASUR that came together with the idea of trying to emulate, to a certain extent, the European Union and thinking in a South American citizenship, that goes beyond the freedom of mobility and actually giving us a more shared identity. Of course, political party changed. We had a right-wing turn in South America, and those ideas were scrapped from the table. UNASUR lost support, and the idea of South American citizenship ended up being just a dream at the moment. But that shows you a little bit of the difference of the regional groupings that we have here. And the chapters are all written by leading migration scholars. So we have chapters not only by Andrew Guedes, but we have also by Leila Chabdou, by Leisa Brumar and Diego Acosta in terms of South America. We have colleagues looking at the Middle East, Gerasipos Tatsurapas, who has done a great contribution trying to make us understand how it works, the commodification of the refugees when some states try to use it to coerce other states. So now, for example, one of the discussions that have emerged as well in this conference is that, okay, how do we deal with the issue? And one of the solutions has been the externalization of refugee protection or migration management. But what are the limits of that as well? And this is an invitation as well for us to think about it. If we are giving the impression that as Europe, we don't want to receive more migrants and we want other states to take care of them, what is the perception for those other states? Well, why should we be doing this? Or what do we get from it? And of course, the EU-Turkey deals have given us some lights already of the limits of that approach. So, looking at the migration governance from other regions as well can help us to understand what happened in our own as well. I asked a question early in the conference about how does it work in terms of diffusion of ideas between regions? And surprising enough, for example, when I was doing interviews in Japan back in 2016, one of the first things that came from the government, that is very homogeneous government, that they consider that migration, they have a very close migration system, is that they were already taking ideas, for example, from Brexit or what was happening in Europe, to make more closer the migration systems. So surprising as it is, and understanding the difference that there are between all the regions, ideas are, transferred from one way to another one. Happen as well, the same discourses that we heard from the colleagues in the previous panel about the communication strategies of how you deal with migration, we see it in places like Chile, for example, where the government, when I interviewed them back in 2015, a right-wing government in principle doesn't necessarily have a problem with migration because they understand that they can be a workforce. Could be cheap labor. And that comes in line, with the neoliberal project that, for example, Chile wanted to put forward. When it became when the right-wing government opposed migration, when they realized as well that they can use it for political gains. So every problem that there was in the country for the last 3 years, when they had any internal political crisis, the government used migration to show that they were having control and trying to externalize the blame for any other social economic problem. So we can see in a way what was happening in Hungary, although not to the extreme of the Cronian type of style, it translates as well in Chile or in Peru and other countries in the world. So it's quite interesting to try to reflect on how ideas transfer from one region to another region. Now, in terms of the framework, and we discuss this in the book that I can pass around in case you want to look it up. We discussed a couple of ideas in the framework, but one of them that we put forward is how we understand the region. And of course, we assume that they are not natural regions, and even if you are proximity, that doesn't mean that regions are going to be constructed as such. And that they are very diverse in form, and of course they sit in between the national and the international, which in a way, it shows one more time that there's a multi-level of international politics in relation to migration management, and the power that they have it distributed, of course, between the subnational, the national, the regional, international levels. And this is, of course, indicative, and you might know from the literature on migration, of the complexities of international governance in relation to migration. We know that in migration governance, the Global Compact on Migration for Safe, Order, and Regular Migration was trying to put a little bit of order, of course, in a non-binding document. It's much more structured when we look about the refugee regime, where already they do have, through the Convention 1951, at least a couple of overall rules that they're set in place. Another difference that we make in the book is about regionalization and regionalism, understanding regionalism as more formal process of migration governance, and regionalization more informal ones. One example that came immediately to mind, for example, is the case of Mexico and the United States. Mexico and the United States and Canada, through NAFTA, now the new agreement, they already had a very deep economic integration project that never included provisions on migration. Migration was the political token that nobody wanted to touch, and the new project doesn't include it either. But we know that there is a very large migration between Mexico and the United States, that it meant that process of regionalization, not formal process, were putting into place. So you can see how regionalization and regionalism can work together as well. The other ideas that we put forward is ideas about governance. And of course, we understand in relation to migration governance, all the policies, all the processes, all the groupings as well, and the actors involved in migration management and control, and as well facilitation. In this book in particular, we develop an understanding of governance that is related particularly to international migration. And this understanding starts from a basic observation that it was reinforced as well through this conference, that international migration happens because other things change. So in these ways, it's epiphenomenal. It's not only migration doesn't only happen, for example, because there's an economic crisis or because there's political turmoil in a particular country. It happens, of course, because there can be economic, political, social, demographical, or environmental change. And all of these one as well can happen together, And this is the difficult sometimes when we have a refugee status determination, because a refugee could leave a place for being persecuted, but at the same time, it can be because there's a climate change, processes that happen in that region that meant that you have to move. So there's a difficulty there. Now, And this as well, Migration Governance Center, that there are different roles and actions and different organizations. Now, the main understanding that we put forward is that governance is a dual process by which organizational systems, and we understand by this one regional organizations, political groupings, states themselves, etc., they try to make sense of what's going on out there. To conceptualize the effects of change in this underlying system, that they can be economic, etc. So what is happening, What's going on? So even as a country, we wonder sometimes when, there's a different mobilities, what's happening here? What are the changes? And the second one is that this migration governance system will try to actually manage or coordinate these effects. So one of the speakers early on talked about the role of uncertainty. And this is very important when we look at this dual conceptualization of governance. Basically, we don't know what is going to happen. And the governance system, how they work, is that they wonder what is happening there. They try to make sense through the media, through policies report, through the quantification of migration, through, et cetera, the possible risk. And then they decide, based on all these elements, how do we manage? How do we respond to migration? For a long time, for example, just to give one example, in the European Union, the way to manage migration has been through deterrence, no? What we can do, we can just deter migration. Make it, very tough, so we give the impression to migrants that they shouldn't come here because it's difficult either to get naturalization, it's difficult to get, access to the welfare system, etc. So that's kind of like the idea of governance that we manage in the book. One of the things, and a couple of points just to highlight in relation to governance, is that the development of regional cooperation signifies the presence of more, not fewer organizations, which already happen in the complex migration regime at the global level. And one more thing just to highlight here is that we tend to believe as well that the effects of international migration on regional governance that they're going to change the system. So basically a migration crisis might change how a region might work. But what the book is showing, and I will tell you that a little bit in a second, is that actually migration systems as well, including those at the regional level, they can play a strong role defining how the challenge is framed. So it's not only that migration is going to tell us how can we change the integration project of the EU. The EU itself and the development for the last 20, 30 years determine how we understand the problem of migration. Okay? And I will show you that in a second. I'm not going to go into depth in all the different chapters of the book, but I'm going to share with you probably the 4 main findings that come from the entire analysis. One of them is that the main chapters of the book show that how systems of governance can play an active role in producing understandings of international migration. And this is something that we explore in relation to the project, but also comes from the book. And in a way, we discuss that regions produce practices, processes, and structures, either formal or informal, that give meaning to migration. Who can enter, on what basis, how long can they stay, and at the same time, and we determine who are the migrants, and what rights do they have, what rights and duties are associated with a particular status, with the migrant category that we give them. In this way, a regional migration, regional governance can constitute international migration as a political and social issue. What do I want to say with this, for example? 2 examples here. One, the European Union, and the chapter by Andrew Geddes explored this in depth. He talked how, within the European Union, understandings of what is the normal prevail and how they manage the crisis. In a way, this idea of normal has been developed for more than 30 years, and it configures the responses to the crisis. So it's not only that these ideas of deterrence, or externalization are completely new. They didn't emerge with the so-called refugee crisis. They have been in the make for the last 30 years. So that tells you in a way that the ways that we frame the crisis is related with what the system produced already. And this actually tells you a little bit why it has been so questioned, the idea of the migration crisis, of the refugee crisis in Europe. What is a crisis? If we consider that Jordan, Lebanon receive even more numbers of Syrian refugees than Europe, why do we think that the crisis became a crisis when it touches the shores of Europe? You know what I mean? Think about the framing of that. So in a way, it's telling you what ideas prevail within the European Union to make of this a crisis. And that shaped the response that they were given. The same happened, for example, with ASEAN governance. In that case, they have been generating powerful ideas for many years that there are two key forms of migration in the region: to work and to seek refugee. Basically, both of them are framed as temporary migration, so people don't stay. Circular migration, that can come and go. If they're refugees, they come temporary and they go back as well. Those ideas have been developed for many years that they create understandings of how we manage migration today. The second one is the potential ambiguities of interdependence. So we have assumed that because of proximity, and interdependence, basically we're going to have better coordination at the regional level. However, this doesn't necessarily mean that there's cooperation on migration. Proximity, of course, can and many times happen. It does lead to cooperation, but at times it doesn't result as such, and there are instead tensions, competition, rivalry, and conflict between states over international migration. For instance, again, I'm going to use the same examples. In ASEAN and the EU, both arrivals by refugees and migrants had led to very strained relations between the states. We can see in the same presentations we had during the morning as well. And raise questions about what are the limits of cooperation, both a supranational EU system, but also in the very strict intergovernmental ASEAN structure. And we explored this in the books of the chapter as well. That's the second one. So there's ambiguities of interdependence. We know that interdependence can lead to cooperation, but not necessarily. The third one is that regional migration governance embodies and even can amplify rather than resolve the key tensions of migration governance more generally. Has been a discussion as well of what does it mean to have more openness, or more closure within migration systems in general, a paradox that has been identified already in migration studies for a long time. This requires focuses on the politics of regional migration governance because the implications of regional cooperation for the allocation and distribution of resources, which is very important, but also of values within the state, can actually reinforce these tensions. For instance, while the NAFTA agreement containing no migration provisions, we can see powerful effects on the migration relationship between the US and Mexico that has been fundamentally centered in the questions about resource and values. Who pays for what, who controls what borders should be contained, etc. Now, these tensions acquire a new level of intensity after 2016 when Donald Trump became president of the United States, but actually they were developed long before. This is my chapter on the book, actually. What we look in the chapter, and very briefly, is two phenomena. One is that there's a path dependence of how Mexico has acted in terms of migration, but also, and this depends in the different geographical dynamics that there are in Mexico as well. Mexico geopolitically is a country of destination, is a sending country, is a transit country as well. And as such, it has all the migration dynamics. And Mexico, what has been doing for a long time, probably in the last 40 years, is that they developed a dual strategy. On the one hand, they have to take care of their own migrants abroad. All the Mexicans, documented and undocumented, are living in the United States. So what they do is that depoliticize migration. They put it at a technical level. They don't politicize, they don't talk about it, they don't complain with the United States. They leave that the technical bodies negotiate and take care of migration. What they accomplish? Very particular things. You know that under Obama, there has been more deportations of Mexican migrants back to Mexico than in many, many years, even before Trump came to power. What Mexicans didn't know is that when the United States sent the deportees, they could send it to any city at any time, any day. So they couldn't manage that. People will arrive and they didn't know how to arrive or where they will arrive. After a lot of negotiation, they managed to block that to 12 points. So the United States will send only to 12 ports, including Mexico City, and it will tell them at what time they will arrive. For Mexico, that was a win-win situation. They already managed to have an outcome with this depoliticization of migration, and interviews will tell me that. We need to depoliticize migration in order to obtain results. That was one strategy. But on the other hand, when it was related to Central American migrants crossing to Mexico or to other group of migrants, Cuban, Haitians, trying to go to the United States, Mexico applied a path dependence. Basically, they didn't contest it, this type of rhetoric that Donald Trump, for example, put forward. They just let it happen, and they collaborated actively with the United States because they understand that they're a key economic partner. And that is reflected by the fact that now, not only Mexico, but Guatemala, Honduras, El Salvador are considered safe countries when they're not. But that means that actually the United States can justify leave asylum seekers in those countries. So the response came, for example, Peña Nieto responded only once to Donald Trump, and that happened 1 year after the initial provocations with the wall. So that tells us that in a way, Mexico, what is happening now, has been the bill for a long time. So this dual proposal of path dependence and depoliticization act depending on their different interests. So that was the third one. And the last one is about this idea between regional and migration governance. New migration governance, and probably you know all the debates that there were around the Global Compact on Migration and the Global Compact on Refugee. All of them include as well strong provisions encouraging regional cooperation. And because they know that most of the dynamics happen within a region. So they say, okay, the best way that we can deal with this is through the region. Now, what we know as well is that because there's an assumption that a stronger regional cooperation could be building block for more effective global framework. Now, the analysis in this book highlights that there's a shifting governance level that do not escape to political dilemmas. So the political dilemmas that we see inside a country, we also see it at the regional level as we see at the international level as well. International migration, as we know, is a reflection of the inequalities in the international system, as one of the colleagues pointed out in the morning, with result that a state can have very different positions and how they could or should be resolved. Now, regional and global migration governance cannot be only understood for spaces where you have to develop new and potential innovative responses to international migrations. Of course, such spaces are necessarily configured by existing approaches and dilemmas, tensions, and trade-offs that shape and are shaped by migration governance. One key example here, for example, is the South American refugee protection regime. That regime has been developed for many years based on this tradition of asylum that South America had, and that it translated in the Cartagena Declaration with an extended definition of refugee protection, and with very strong systems every 10 years that they get together and they review the Cartagena Declaration, they see what the region is doing, and that translated in a harmonization of local law. The local law in many countries of South America is quite strong in relation to refugee and asylum protection. However, what happened with the Venezuelan migration happened? There are more than 5 million Venezuelans living outside the country at the moment, many absorbed by South American countries. Peru, that is not a migration country. Colombia, the neighbor country, received more 1 million refugees. Chile, Brazil, etc. None of those countries apply the extended definition of the Cartagena Declaration. That means that many refugees haven't been recognized despite that the instruments are there. So you know what I'm trying to say is that basically even if we have a strong regional framework, the political dilemmas, the trade-off still might actually go over that. So we need to be mindful as well when we're thinking about regional solutions, because regional solutions might not be all. Well, we discussed this in many debates, and sorry that I had to give you such a big overview, but it's difficult to summarize 250 pages in 20 minutes. But if you want to have more questions, I'm very happy to answer them. And also, if you want to get the book, there's a code offer as well that you can use to get it, and you can read more in detail as well. Thank you so much.